All right. So good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Lee, and as director of Fordham University's Curran Center for American Catholic Studies, it's my honor to welcome you all to this evening's webinar. Bienvenidos a todos. In particular, I'd like to welcome anyone who is new to a Curran Center event. We're very glad to have you here. Our work at the center is multifaceted. In addition to sponsoring lectures and conferences and other public-facing events, we have a concentration in Catholic studies in which 75 undergraduate students are currently participating. It would take too long to describe all of the interdisciplinary work we carry out, whether in Catholic social teaching, literature and aesthetics, theology and philosophy, the social sciences, or history. But before we get to the heart of this evening's webinar, I'd like to spend a moment talking about the reason for it, namely our new Scholar Essay Prize for Catholic Studies in the Americas. Well, we support the enterprise of Catholic studies by doing many things, like inviting a number of scholars to campus, or supporting the Catholic Practice in the Americas book series with Fordham University Press. This essay prize was conceived as a way to support a population that is often overlooked, scholars who are either Ph.D. candidates or recent graduates at the beginning stages of their careers. We believe that they represent not just the future of Catholic studies, but often also its most creative and groundbreaking present. And this belief has been borne out by the first winners of our award. From historicizing the Vietnamese American Catholic experience, or reconstructing the experiences of enslaved peoples in the United States through Jesuit records, or articulating a theology of voice in the Catholic clergy sexual abuse survivor movement, the Essay Prize winners have shown innovative thinking, creative use of sources, and thoughtful attention to historically marginalized populations. They are doing work we should all be paying attention to. So I thank you, everyone, for your presence tonight. And I encourage those of you who are eligible to apply for next year's prize to do so, or to spread the word about this special opportunity among your networks. Okay, enough of me. Now I will turn things over to my colleague, Associate Director of the Curran Center, John Seitz, who will moderate the session and introduce tonight's speaker, the fourth winner of the new Scholar Essay Prize for Catholic Studies in the Americas. John, take it away.
Hi, everybody, and thanks so much, Michael. Really glad to be here today to introduce our speaker, the winner of the fourth annual New Scholar Essay Prize. Our winner is Dr. Raúl Zegarra. Dr. Zegarra is the author of 4 books, most recently, A Revolutionary Faith from Stanford University Press in 2023. He's also authored multiple book chapters, academic articles, translations, and op-eds. Raúl has advanced degrees from the University of Chicago, from the Pontifical Catholic University in Peru, and from the University of Notre Dame. As you will learn more in his remarks today, his research focuses on the relationship between faith and politics, with particular emphasis on how this relationship shapes the identity and commitments of minoritized groups. He currently serves as Assistant Professor of Theology at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, and is part of the advisory team at the Hispanic Theological Initiative in Princeton, New Jersey. Raúl's award-winning essay, The Preferential Option of the Poor, Liberation Theology, Pentecostalism, and the New Forms of Sacralization, draws on a substantive body of research and critical theoretical and theological analysis to make a case for a revision of existing ideas about the fate of liberation theology since the rise of Pope John Paul II. Zegarra uses comparison with Pentecostal communities in Peru to demonstrate that Catholic liberation motifs and orientations live on among Catholics populating and working in service organizations that are on the surface ostensibly secular. This argument has consequences for the definition of religion, for the meaning of secularization, and for the fate and future of liberation theology as a force for change in the world. We were thrilled to receive his essay as part of our essay competition. And we've been excited to watch Raúl's career continue to flourish and his ideas continue to get attention from around the scholarly and ecclesial communities. Before turning it over to Dr. Zegarra, I want to go over some of the details of our time together in the webinar. So Raúl plans to offer his comments for about 40 to 45 minutes, and we'll have an opportunity for Q&A after the conclusion of his remarks. But you can, as the remarks are ongoing, please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box as they occur to you, and prepare to offer them later via the features on Zoom that we'll implement. Put you on the screen if you wish. We'll try to wrap up around 6:45 or so. And I want also to note that our talk today is being recorded and will be available on the Current Center's website in a few days' time. All right, and with that, I turn the floor over to you, Raúl. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Good evening. It is a true pleasure and honor to be here, over Zoom with you today. I want to thank the kindness and support of the staff and leadership of the Current Center, not only for the generous award, but also for making this lecture possible. Thanks to Maria Dorzulli, John Seitz, Patrick Verrell, Michael Lee, and those in the award committee who honor me with this prize. I am humbled, but also energized and motivated by your decision. Thank you. I believe that before we start, it makes sense to spend a few minutes giving some context to this presentation, but placing it within the wider arc of my research agenda. Currently, my work is divided in two main research streams. The first is the comparative study of what I call political Catholics and political evangelicals in the US and Latin America. I'm interested in exploring the influence of political Catholics and evangelicals on each other, the role in fostering or undermining democracy, and what they tell us about the formation of new sacred forms of life in the midst of the crisis of religious and democratic institutions. The most recent examples of this line of research are my fourth book, A Revolutionary Faith, just mentioned a moment ago, and the award-winning article, The Preferential Option of the Four, that brings us together tonight. The third installation of this line of research is a presentation I'm giving this evening. The second line of research is represented by my current book project, provisionally titled Sacred Identities, Latinos and the Intersectional Politics of Faith. This project focuses on the experiences of people of Latin American descent in the United States, struggling to make sense of their faith amid great economic injustice and racialization. Sacred Identities attempts to gain deeper understanding of the religious ethics of Latinos when the fair distribution of social goods is at stake, paying special attention to the intersection of race, ethnicity, class, and gender. I have explored these issues through my classes, conference papers, and my engagement with the Hispanic Theological Initiative. These two lines of research are deeply connected to each other. Together, they showcase my fundamental methodological commitments, as well as my distinct contributions to the study of global Catholicism. Key among those commitments is the need of a multidimensional inquiry that takes a transnational perspective and brings into critical conversation different traditions of thought. Hence, one must avoid oversimplifications that offer monocausal explanations to religious ethical matters. Rather, the task is to provide an adequate account of the phenomenon at hand without discarding normative, practical, and fundamental questions that religious actors and communities face day to day. Further, one must also bring this account to the level of the justification of claims and pronounce judgment regarding better or worse religious answers to a given problem. Lastly, and quite importantly, it is key to leave some room for tension and for the irresolvable. With this, I now turn to the subject of today's presentation. This evening, I want to explore the current crisis of democracy in Latin America from the perspective of the religious ethics of politically active Catholics and evangelicals. Using Peru as a case study, my goal is to identify and examine two types of religious political configurations whose relationship with both the ethos of democracy and the ethos of Christianity is becoming tenuous. I term these types reactionary denominationalism in the evangelical case, and progressive corporatism in the Catholic case. This is, if you will, the sequel of the article that won the current Center's Prize. My argument is twofold. On the one hand, despite important democratizing role of evangelical Christianity in Latin America, I argue that such democratizing influence seems to be in paradoxical regression. A significant number of evangelicals seem to be using the procedural mechanisms of democracy to erode the normative commitments of democracy. In turn, this instrumentalization of the democratic system seems to be eroding the normative commitments of Christianity as well. I call this religious political model reactionary denominationalism. On the other hand, I argue that despite the voluntary embracement of the values of democracy by the Catholic Church and the general movement toward morally and politically progressive beliefs among Catholics, this shift may have left Catholicism in a position of weakness vis-a-vis the current crisis of democracy. Indeed, the progressive leaning of many Catholics seemed to collide with the cultural conservatism of the Catholic Church, creating a gap between the laity and the Church's teachings and hierarchy. This weakens institutional affiliation and deprives Catholic progressives from access to the organizational strengths of the Catholic Church, which were central in prior crises of democracy in the 20th century. I term this religious political model progressive corporatism. The goal of this lecture is to flesh out these two ideal types of religious organization in Latin America, paying particular attention to the current crisis of democracy in Peru. I proceed in 5 steps. First, I turn to the Catholic evangelical dynamics in Latin America through a critical examination of the debate between sociologists José Casanova and David Martin. Second, I provide an account of the model of reactionary denominationalism. Third, I turn to the model of progressive corporatism. Fourth, I focus on the current political crisis in Peru. Fifth, I examine the Catholic Evangelical Conservative Alliance in Peru. And I close with some concluding remarks. So let me turn to the first section, the parallel Reformations debate. By sociologist José Casanova's own admission, David Martin's work and his find multiple points of convergence. In fact, as Casanova notes referring to Martin, quote, I can hardly find any major disagreement with his main ideas or with his interpretations on practically any sociological issue, end quote. Precisely for this reason, it is important to explore one of the few areas of serious disagreement between them, their interpretations of the Pentecostal explosion in Latin America. Put simply, Casanova's main concern is Martin's apparent one-sidedness in his account of both the growth of Pentecostalism and its role in the process of democratization of Latin America. Martin's account seems to overemphasize the extent of the influence of the strengths of Pentecostalism to the point of overlooking certain opportunity structures that allow such strengths to have positive outcomes. In Casanova's view, Martin's analysis of Pentecostalism neglects the internal and global transformation of the Catholic Church toward what Casanova calls voluntary disestablishment. With this term, Casanova refers to the Catholic Church's voluntary embracement of the dissolution of the church establishment regime and its correlative embracement of democracy and human rights. After Vatican II, globally, and the Bishops' Conference of Medellin, locally, the Latin American Catholic Church shifted from a model of religious monopoly to the model of the denomination. In fact, this shift and its global nature allows Casanova to speak of a global denominationalism as currently emerging mode of religiosity, not only for Catholicism, but for most religions in the world, due to their deep territorialization and increasing religious pluralism. But as we will see shortly, the advantages of the denominational model, the lack of strong institutional borders, unity of experience over institutional belonging, focus on the intrinsic value of the individual, and pragmatism are also some of its weaknesses in moments of crisis. What matters at this juncture is that Casanova's critique is crucial to understand why Pentecostalism grew and how it did so, As Casanova notes, at the time in which Pentecostalism started its demographic explosion, the Catholic Church enjoyed a high level of credibility and acceptance among most Latin Americans. In fact, we could fairly say that Pentecostalism started growing in a moment of revival and renewal of Catholicism. After all, the Catholic Church made the defense of human rights, democracy, and the poor one of its key commitments in many countries of Latin America. Starting in the 1960s, the Catholic Church provided one of the few visible and cohesive institutional responses to the violence of authoritarian regimes in the region. Such a response left Catholicism in a position of relative organizational and moral strength. In this sense, the Catholic Church could have taken a very different approach to the growth of Pentecostalism. It could have used its organizational and moral strength to try to actively defeat it, perhaps of trying to retain hegemony and strengthening alliances with the state. But this was not the case. For this reason, the importance of the voluntary disestablishment represented by Vatican II at Medellin cannot be overemphasized. Of course, this does not mean that all Catholics were aligned or that the Church enthusiastically embraced the condition of a denomination. It simply means that for both moral and pragmatic reasons, the Church rejected the model of religious monopoly. Further, the laity embraced this establishment as well, by forming political fronts which no longer made the defense of the old prerogatives of the Catholic Church their main concern. In this sense, both at the institutional and social levels, Catholics willingly moved in the direction of this establishment, which helps to explain more adequately and less unilaterally the Pentecostal revolution. Of course, Casanova's point is not to undermine the importance of Pentecostalism in both the religious pluralization of Latin America and in the process of democratization of the region. Rather, his goal is to place this pluralization in a broader framework. Thus, Casanova advances the argument of parallel reformations. Quote, the Pentecostal challenge reinforced a dynamic of Catholic reformation which had a global character beyond the region, while the Catholic transformation opened up the opportunity structures within which the Pentecostal explosion could take place, end quote. I agree with Casanova. However, there is an aspect of the Pentecostal revolution examined by Martin which deserves more attention. I am referring to the anti-democratic tendencies of Latin American Pentecostalism, or what I call reactionary denominationalism. Part 2. The emergence of reactionary denominationalism. One of the most fascinating aspects of Martin's study of the Pentecostal revolution is his careful, albeit brief, consideration of what happens when an inherently denominational and voluntaristic tradition, like Pentecostalism, migrates from a highly differentiated society to a highly hierarchical one. Martin's reflections on this matter are of great importance to understand current developments of Pentecostalism. In turn, these developments may suggest some caution in regards to Casanova's somewhat enthusiastic approach to the phenomenon that he describes as a global denominationalism. Put briefly, the problem is this. In the case of the migration of Pentecostalism from the highly differentiated society of the US to the highly hierarchical and monopolistic Latin American milieu, what was originally meant to be a religion that operates culturally, primarily through the formation of an alternative Christian culture, the Church, and secondarily through the transformation of non-Christian culture, these require a more direct political intervention. The way in which this happens varies, but evidence suggests that there has been some tendency in the past to support the status quo. Pentecostal leaders offer their support to morally questionable rulers in order to gain more social recognition that then they use to develop their mission of cultural formation transformation. Significant political trade-offs may become negative incentives to compromise moral values. The two most striking cases are the support the Pentecostal leaders lent to the bloody dictatorships of Augusto Pinochet in Chile and Efraín Ríos Montt in Guatemala. It is perhaps worth noting, too, that Ríos Montt was the first evangelical head of state in Latin America, which stresses the risks of overemphasizing political representation over moral standing. These two cases show that the pressure to obtain social recognition in Latin America, after decades of social marginalization, can produce nefarious incentives for Pentecostals. Toleration of authoritarianism appeared to some as a price worth paying in order to gain social recognition, legal prerogatives, and access to the decision-making process. An experience analogous to the moral compromises made by many evangelicals during the Donald Trump presidency. Unfortunately, despite the rather extreme examples that the alliances with Pinochet and Ríos Montt represent, the anti-democratic tendencies among many of the most vocal evangelical leaders are less exceptional than what one would expect. And this is precisely the paradox that the notion of reactionary denominationalism attempts to capture. One of the central assumptions of the denominational model is the disappearance, complete or de facto, of the model of established churches. The very existence of denominations requires that there is a plurality of legitimate religious alternatives. Denominationalism presupposes pluralism, freedom of religion, and the lack of coercive methods to assure religious belonging. For these reasons, the denominational model could not have taken root in Latin America prior to the wars of independence of the 19th century and the progressive dissolution of the old alliance between the Catholic Church and the state. In fact, we do not see a truly denominational model until the second half of the 20th century, and even then, the model was just emerging. My point is that these conditions, the long-standing Catholic monopoly together with the belated and weak emergence of democratic regimes, did not make things easy for the newly growing Protestant denominations. Their need to gain social recognition and mobility created incentives for morally questionable alliances. But perhaps more decisively, the lack of a strong democratic system coupled with the goal of Christianizing society created incentives to advance a Christian moral agenda in a monopolistic fashion. Here lies a paradox. For the very emergence and consolidation of evangelical Christianity, as a sizable minority in most Latin American countries, required the emergence of a denominational, democratic, and pluralistic model. However, the social, cultural, and political conditions of the region have created incentives to pursue an evangelical agenda via procedural democracy, but in a way that undermines the normative content of democracy. That is, equal rights for all, equal respect, recognition of differences in worldviews, protection of minorities, and the creation of policies and institutions that promote universal access to basic social goods. Thus, depending on the democratic impetus at the basis of denominationalism for its very existence, many evangelical leaders and church members are becoming increasingly reactionary in their ways of doing politics. They instrumentalize the procedures of democracy to elect representatives who campaign on the promise of giving political and legal sanction to pro-family and pro-life religious moral agendas. They have become almost inseparable from the evangelical identity. But these agendas are reactionary. The freedom of conscience for which dissenters so hardly fought, now achieved by their historical heirs, is currently denied to new dissenting groups if their freedom is perceived as a threat to the so-called traditional family or the life of the unborn. Ironically, these perceived threats are often associated with so-called globalism and its alleged secularizing and liberalizing agenda. Ironically, indeed, since the model of reactionary denominationalism is so clearly influenced by the moral majority movement that emerged in the United States in 1979. Arguably, this model has been one of the most successful exports of a globalist evangelical movement. But the problem goes beyond the erosion of democracy. Reactionary denominationalism also undermines the Christian ethos that evangelical leaders are supposed to defend. For most Latin Americans, sharing the gospel through coercive means appears as antithetical to the gospel message itself. Coerciveness, coupled with alliances with morally questionable characters, the Pinochets and Ríos Montt of the past or the Trumps or Bolsonaros of the present, seem to be inspiring a disappointment and turning away many evangelicals. I will expand on these issues shortly. Part 3, the emergence of progressive corporatism. Unfortunately, The development of what I call progressive corporatism may put Catholics in Latin America, the majority of whom are moderate to progressive, in a position of relative weakness to confront the ongoing erosion of democracy. The political activism of many Catholics during the times of political violence in Latin America quickly faced significant and decisive backlash. Already in 1972, in the Episcopal meeting of Sucre, Bolivia, the progressive bishops saw their control over the bishop's governing body, known as CELEM, significantly diminish. The election of Pope John Paul II in 1978 and his fear of a politicization of the Church intensified the backlash with the appointment of multiple conservative bishops in the region. By 1992, when the General Conference of Latin American Bishops took place in Santo Domingo, progressive bishops and activists had lost almost all their institutional support among the Catholic hierarchy. Without access to the resources of CELEM, a movement that heavily depended on those structures of support started to see the end of its initial growth. Acknowledging this conservative turn, the faithful and some bishops, priests and religious sisters and brothers, decided to keep working for the most disenfranchised, but they did so more than ever from within civil society. They formed nonprofits, co-ops, popular education institutes, magazines, and so forth, all of them shaped by their Catholic faith and by a liberationist orientation, but now independent from the institutional control of the Church. I call these spaces para-ecclesial structures. Progressive Catholics saw these spaces as new sacred spaces in which their Catholic commitments could be genuinely and freely expressed. This migration to para-ecclesial structures did not necessarily replace church attendance, faith-based communities, and the like, but it did become a way to channel the liberationist work that was previously done with institutional support of the Church. Further, this shift toward para-ecclesial structures shows the inherently expansive nature of the progressive commitments of many Catholics. Over time, the initial struggle for survival against poverty or the violence of terrorist groups and the state became a struggle to enhance life in all its aspects, including matters of gender equality, the legalization of same-sex unions, anti-racism, environmental justice, and the like. Unfortunately for most Catholics, the Catholic Church has not been equally supportive of all these struggles for liberation. Official Catholic teachings on gender and sexuality, together with the response to the sexual abuse crisis, have produced significant distance between most Catholics and institutional Church. Perhaps this is a confirmation that the para-ecclesial structures are here to stay as new sacred spaces for the relocation of a liberationist religious impetus that the Catholic Church seems unable to satisfy. This is a matter that requires more careful consideration and empirical verification. But growing rates of disaffiliation, especially among the Catholic youth, point in this direction. Disaffiliation seems to relate not to a rejection of faith itself, but to a rejection of a faith that does not speak credibly, especially the younger generation. My point is that this relocation of the religious impetus behind the struggle of liberation may have produced a new type of religious formation. I call it progressive corporatism. As it is well known, before the advent of the denominations and the beginning of the process of democratization of Latin American societies, the dominant religious model was the Catholic religious monopoly. This model was corporatist in two different ways, which generally align with two different historical periods. First, it was corporatist in its all-encompassing form during the colonial period. This was a model in which the body politic and the body of Christ, the Church, were basically indistinguishable. This was the model of a state-centric authoritarian rule, patrimonialism, and hierarchical subordination in which different corporations existed, but ultimately only to serve the economic, political, and religious interests of the Catholic crown. Hence the persecution of Jews, their forced conversions or expulsions, and the importance of the Inquisition to guarantee the strength of the body politic body of Christ. Similarly important were the reducciones de indios, indigenous settlements, which became key to Christianize, tax, and govern indigenous populations during the colonial period. In its second stage, we see something different but still corporatist. This is the stage of the newly independent 19th century republics. in which the body politic, the body of Christ association has started to lose strength, slowly moving toward this establishment. In some places, notably Mexico and Uruguay, this involuntary disestablishment was the result of active secularizing policies advanced by the governing elites. But in most places, proto-democratic ideals gradually led to a less dramatic but real erosion of the Catholic establishment. What matters is that in this stage, the Catholic body also took a corporatist approach, but this time to defend its interests against the threat of hostile liberal elites, the beginning of the growth of Pentecostalism, and more generally, the perceived or actual erosion of Catholic societal privilege over education, marriage, and other key aspects of social life. The body politic and the church body were not one single Catholic body anymore, but the Catholic Church still used its massive organizational strength to support multiple corporations that defended its diminishing social prerogatives. The voluntary disestablishment of the Catholic Church initiated by Vatican II led to a completely new understanding of the relationship between the body politic and the body of Christ, the Church. Hence, a new corporatist model emerged, one that I define somewhat paradoxically as progressive. In this new model, the body of Christ is not understood any longer as solely represented by the Catholic Church. The duty of the Catholic Church is no more to protect the interests of the Catholic institution or the Catholic faithful alone, but the interests of all human beings, and gradually of non-human animals and the planet. The body has become universal, Catholic with lowercase c. In this new self-conception, the Catholic Church has become the defender of the dignity of all humanity. We can find evidence of this in many documents of Vatican II, for instance, in Gaudium et Spes. Similarly, we can see this movement toward progressive corporatism in the transformation of the papacy and papal encyclicals, especially after the aftermath of World War II. As Casanova shows, the voluntary disestablishment of the Catholic Church repositioned the papacy. The Pope became the first citizen of the emerging global society. He was no more the head of a territorialized church, but the head of a global church that now speaks to humanity as a whole. Indeed, the protection of the sacredness of the person through the commitment to universal human rights, rather than the protection of the rights of the church, is the first central tenet of progressive corporatism. The second is the expansiveness of this commitment, which goes beyond the most flagrant violations of the dignity of the person, like those of state terror or insurgent groups, to focus also on less obvious forms of violence, like the theologically justified forms of misogyny and homophobia present in the Catholic Church. Of course, we should not overstate this progressive turn. It was never unanimous, nor sufficiently encompassing. Even charismatic and inclusive figures like Pope Francis do not embody a fully progressive turn. But here precisely lies the issue. The progressive turn of the Catholic Church after Vatican II has led to the faithful's demand of more change than the one the Catholic Church seems capable of currently offering. The progressive turn of Catholicism has weakened the institutional Catholic body by committing itself to the Catholic, lowercase c, universal body of humanity through the defense of the dignity of all people. Thus, progressive corporatism emerges as a movement of immanent critique, partly inspired by changes promoted by the institutional church itself, but whose critical power and expectations of change surpass the institutional church's capacity, at its current capacity for change. Progressive corporatism, however, does not necessarily invite to a break with Catholicism. Rather, it elicits different forms of what we may call diffuse Catholicism, in which people who feel bound to tradition find new ways to articulate it by engaging with social change or the representatives of other traditions, in the words of Hans Joas. In this sense, progressive corporatism is not unlike the varieties of Catholicism of popular religion and its syncretic tendencies that we know, especially in Latin America. But its distinguishing feature is its deep commitment to the moral universalism of the culture of human rights. Naturally, the weakening of Catholic institutional affiliation is not necessary, but rather contingent on the radically differing understandings of the defense of the dignity of people that most Catholics and the magisterium of the Catholic Church hold. From this follows that a different outcome is possible if, for instance, Catholic teachings on gender and sexuality are modified. But such changes do not seem on sight, and if feasible, it is hard to predict their effect on the faithful. What matters is that the pluralistic and morally universal commitments of progressive corporatism seem to have an unintended effect. By weakening Catholicism and Catholic affiliation, progressive corporatism appears to be weakening one of the few actors whose institutional strength has been decisive to sustain democracy in Latin America in times of severe crisis. This takes me to part 4, the Peruvian crisis, 2016 to 2023. Let me expand on the models of reactionary denominationalism and progressive corporatism by focusing on the current crisis of democracy in Peru. Religious groups, like all other groups, respond to different contextual realities, but unlike other groups, they must ask themselves about the meaning of moral agency within the wider compass of reality, a reality that decisively includes their understanding of the will of God. As noted earlier, when it comes to the denominational model, its ideal place of growth is a democratic system that not only has a strong procedural democracy, but that has also a democratic way of life. When a democratic way of life is fragile or absent, religious denominations may approach their fundamental questions with new eyes, considering alternatives for the fulfillment of God's will that, sometimes willingly, sometimes inadvertently, can erode both the democratic foundations of the denominational model and the foundations of their faith as well. Such fragile conditions have now become the norm in Latin America. On December 7th, 2022, democratically elected President Pedro Castillo attempted to disband Congress, intervening in the judiciary and in the electoral tribunals. Castillo, a former teacher and union leader who won the presidency in one of the most unlikely outcomes of a Peruvian presidential election in recent years, was facing savage opposition in Congress and prosecution for corruption charges. Without strong allies in his own party, or anywhere else really, Castillo took the nuclear option of unconstitutionally disbanding Congress. Castillo's self-coup utterly failed. Congress moved quickly, successfully impeaching Castillo and removing him from office. Soon after, Castillo was arrested on his way to the Embassy of Mexico, where he was expecting to receive political asylum. Following the constitutional succession, Castillo's vice president, Dina Boluarte, was sworn in as the first female president of Peru on the same day, December 7, 2022. All this happened in the same day. Boluarte's first presidential address to the nation asked Peruvians for a truce to overcome the political crisis. But almost immediately after her inauguration, social mobilization started in most regions of the country. People had a wide variety of demands, from the reinstatement of Castillo to the convocation of a constitutional assembly. Soon enough, the main driving force of the protest was the resignation of Boluarte to trigger general elections toward the end of 2023, this year. As of now, there is no indication that Boluarte or Congress attempt to shorten their terms despite the massive low approval that they have. The crisis of Peruvian democracy, of course, is not simply constitutional. Over 50 people have been killed in the protests due to police repression. Multiple recordings obtained from security cameras and protesters' cell phones show that the police have been shooting people directly, at short distance, and more than once to the head. Despite the government's denials of state repression and the allegation that the protesters are the true source of violence, the repression is clear and no proportional violence is coming from the protesters, as multiple local and international human rights organizations have reported. The Peruvian crisis started, at least in this version, with the runoff presidential election of 2016. In this election, Pablo Kuczynski narrowly defeated Keiko Fujimori. Fujimori did not accept the results. Her party had already obtained 73 out of the 130 seats of Congress prior to the runoff, and she used that majority to undermine Kuczynski's weak congressional presence. His party only obtained 18 seats. Only 2 years into his term, Kuczynski, harassed by the Fujimori forces and facing prosecution for corruption charges, had to resign to avoid impeachment. In 2018, Martín Vizcarra, Kuczynski's vice president, took over, only to meet a similar fate, this time through impeachment and removal from office in 2020. Between then and now, 4 more presidents followed, none of which completed a full term due to the harassment of Congress. Further, during most of 2023, Congress has been taking aggressive measures to exercise control over the Constitutional Court and the Elections Court. For this reason, several political analysts now speak of a congressional dictatorship in Peru. Part 5. New religious developments and their role in the crisis. My brief account of the current political crisis in Peru should allow us to better contextualize the serious risks that reactionary denominationalism and progressive corporatism represent for both democracy and the Christian ethos. Perhaps the best way to make this clear is by focusing on one of the most recent and salient political religious developments in Peru and the region, the political alliance of conservative Catholics and evangelicals, the clearest expression today of reactionary denominationalism. The conservative backlash experienced by liberationist forces in Latin America had another important and unintended effect beyond crippling progressive Catholicism. It planted the seeds for a political alliance, rather than a spiritual or theological one, between conservative Catholics and evangelicals, who gather around a religious moral agenda that became their political priority. The mid-2010s seem to represent a turning point in this regard in Peru. In 2014, the Peruvian Ministry of Health approved a protocol for therapeutical abortions, a long overdue protocol for the only existing legal form of abortion in Peru. The protocol provoked strong antagonism from conservative religious leaders, Catholic and evangelical alike. They protested against what they perceive as an attack on the life of the unborn. In addition, an intensified debate regarding whether the so-called gender ideology should be taught in public schools brought the conservative factions of Catholicism and evangelical Christianity to the drawing table. The result was the first ever interdenominational statement to oppose abortion, under the title Compromiso por el Perú, Commitment to Peru. Politically, however, this moral alliance had still to prosper through a unified electoral front. This was finally achieved with the presidential candidacy of Rafael López Aliaga in 2021 and his election as mayor of Lima in October of 2022. Rafael López Aliaga, an Opus Dei Catholic, had 2 significant advantages. He could present himself as a successful business person and as a devout man of faith committed to the pro-life and pro-family religious moral agenda. His 2021 run for president was ultimately unsuccessful. He placed 3rd after Castillo and Fujimori, but he was able to get 13 representatives elected to Congress with his party Renovación Popular, a decisive minority equivalent to 10% of the share of Congress. This small but crucial victory was indeed the first tangible fruit of the conservative political alliance described earlier. Only over a year after their election, López Aliaga's representative had proved to be one of the most reliable conservative forces in Congress. Despite the failure of this presidential run, López Aliaga soon regrouped and mounted a successful mayoral campaign to become mayor of the city of Lima. Further, his party won 12 out of 43 additional mayoral elections, making it the party with most mayorships in the region of Lima. Two aspects of this victory are worth noting. First, this election makes López Aliaga a very powerful political figure. Now he runs an 11 million people city with a multi-million budget and steady media coverage. Moreover, López Aliaga counts with a network of powerful allies, thanks to the election of several other mayors from his party. Second, and decisively, in both his unsuccessful presidential campaign and his successful mayoral run, Lopez Aliaga openly advanced a religious moral agenda of reactionary denominationalism. Surely, this is not the only reason why he was elected, but it was an important aspect of people's decision-making. Likely, the combination of the religious moral agenda and the perception of his business acumen work in his favor, especially in a highly polarized context in which the vote was divided among too many candidates and parties. What matters at this juncture is that in a highly polarized context, with very little room for dialogue and consensus, forces that can unify under a clear message that resonates with important minorities of the population have considerable advantages. The pro-life and pro-family message has that strength. Recent polls show that most Peruvians have somewhat more progressive leanings when it comes to abortion, reproductive health, and sexual orientation. However, in a context of great division, conservative Catholics and conservative evangelicals can produce effective electoral and legislative alliances. The victory of Lopez Aliaga is a clear example whose consequences are still to be seen. What is undeniable is that Lopez Aliaga's victory, his party's presence in Congress, and the possibility of pursuing alliances with other conservative forces have the potential to further erode democracy. This is indeed the risk of reactionary denominationalism. In this model, the plurality of options, religious and political, does not lead to the embracement of pluralism as a form of democratic living together. Rather, the plurality of options is used as an opportunity to advance the interests of a strong minority that can articulate a persuasive agenda in the midst of chaos. Once victory is achieved, the goal is to dismantle the structures that allow the coexistence of a plurality of worldviews in order to enforce an exclusionary religious moral agenda. Let me conclude with a note of sober hope despite this dire scenario. Religion is growing and changing in Latin America through the religious reconfiguration of the continent and through religious reconfigurations within the Christian denominations. So far, these interdenominational reconfigurations seem to be pointing in two directions. In the evangelical camp, we see an important tendency toward reactionary denominationalism, with weak progressive countervailing forces. Such a model can erode democratic culture and the Christian ethos. It has already done so in Peru and other places. But denominationalism does not have to be reactionary. In fact, denominationalism emerges as a response to reactionary forces. One can only hope that the denominational model can recreate itself, returning anew to its originating ideals, while keeping the strong Christian identity that has nurtured the spiritual hunger of so many of its followers. But current political incentives in Peru and Latin America do not seem to favor this outcome for now. In the Catholic camp, we see an important tendency toward progressive corporatism, whose migration to parecclesial structures or more individualistic forms of religious expression have disembedded it from the institutional Catholic Church. Unintendedly, by committing to the democratic ethos, progressive corporatism may be weakening the Christian ethos it wants to preserve. Central to that Christian ethos are the twofold commandment to love God and neighbor and the formation of a Christian fellowship. Ultimately, the work of social justice cannot ever encompass the theological and eschatological dimensions of Christian love. In the current context, self-sacrifice and compromise seems imperative in order to recreate Christian fellowship within the Catholic Church, so that love for God and neighbor remain unified in an alternative polity whose strength lies in not conforming to the politics of this world. But this is a task constantly hampered by a large portion of the leadership of the Church, whose inability to rethink the meaning of Christian fellowship in an inclusive fashion keeps pushing the faithful away. Reactionary denominationalism and progressive corporatism do not seem to offer much hope in the present context. But human action is creative, non-predictable or teleological. Unexpected turns do regularly take place, opening spaces to until then unforeseen possibilities. Perhaps this is one of those moments. We seem to be witnessing a simultaneous crisis of democracy and Christianity, but every season of crisis is an opportunity to give new expression to the inner impulse of each of these traditions. As Ernst Troeltsch puts it, quote, "Thoughts will be necessary, which have not yet been thought. And when they have been created and expressed, they will meet the fate which always awaits every flesh creation of religious and ethical thought. They will render indispensable services, and they will develop profound energies, but they will never fully realize their actual ideal intention within the sphere of our earthly struggle and conflict," end quote. Perhaps the present crisis of democracy and Christianity can elicit a renewed form of democratic and Christian living. For this, we may need new awakenings, secular and religious, of their inner impulses within democracy and Christianity. Fortunately, these revivals are more frequent in history than what they seem. In the long history of Christianity and democracy, these inner impulses have always found new creative expressions. Perhaps they can do it again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raúl. What a wonderful and rich, layered and complicated but interesting talk with an incredible amount of implication and for our world, for our future, and for the conversations within the church. I want to remind our listeners that there is a Q&A button that is associated with the webinar in Zoom, and you can add your questions for Professor Zegarra in the Q&A, and the moderators will see those questions and we'll be able to air them out. We can also give you the permission to talk on screen. So you're welcome also to do that. Maybe we'll invite you in that way. Since I don't see any questions quite yet in the Q&A, people are probably getting their thoughts together. Maybe I'll start with my own question. There's so much to think about here, and there's so many different layers to what you offered here. You're involved with a huge array of disciplinary conversations, from political theory, philosophy, theology, sociology, and history. There's just so much to tackle. So my question comes out of my thinking, my training in the study of religion and in religious studies, and it has to do with the category of the sacred, as you use it in your description of these secular organizations, nonprofits, journals, co-ops that are independent of the church and that are ostensibly non-religious in some way, but that you want to call sacred spaces. And so I'm interested in that category of the sacred, and in what ways that category is particularly useful to you in describing these particular organizations. And if you can reflect on why it might be useful to use that word, the sacred or sacred spaces, in a setting that probably, I would imagine, looks different from spaces that we often associate with sacred spaces. So I'm wondering, why particularly that term, and what it offers you, what kind of leverage or interpretive heft it provides in your analysis.
Thank you, John. That's a very rich question. Let me try to respond taking sort of two different angles. One, if you will, more empirical, and one more theoretical. One of the reasons why I approach this way is because this comes from people's own utterances and descriptions of how they thought about these spaces. So a good chunk of that work, because the talk was going a slightly different direction, but is in the article that won the prize, and also in my book, A Revolutionary Faith. But I conducted interviews and also drew, I guess, from ethnographic work. And one of the things that you saw very steadily is that people were describing this transition, right? Not finding kind of church spaces to do their faithful work for liberation and switching to some of these other spaces. They were naming these spaces as their faith communities, as their sacred spaces, as their places to live their faith, right? So there is something here that really comes just from the way people are imagining these I use the space metaphor. It's more than space, right? It's time, it's a space. It's really something not so like a committee meeting on a Friday, right? And I think that's important because that sense of this is more than just that. It's more than just getting together in a house or in a basement or whatever. It's part of the issue of this sense of sacredness that, as I said, comes a bit from people's own description of the relationship with some of these co-ops, institutes, whatever. So that's one thing. From a theoretical level, though, which I think overlaps with these, usually approach the concept of the sacred, drawing a bit from Hans Joas and his own work on sacralization. And at the most basic level, this then gets more layered. I think that the basic phenomenological condition of the sacred is that you have some experience of self-transcendence. That doesn't have to be positive or negative necessarily in terms of moral value, just something that really takes you out of your sort of individual world and makes you think about a broader sense of reality. It just can be basic forms of solidarity, noticing others, or just thinking about God or something like that, right? And I think this is also what happens with these spaces that I mentioned, the periclesial structures, right? The people are not gathering there just to hang together and, do flyers or posters or whatever. They're doing that too. But they're doing that with a very clear consciousness that this is something about what God wants us to do, to help the poor, the refugee, the immigrants, the people who have been arrested unfairly, and so on and so forth. So I think that this basic level of self-transcendence is very clear in people, and then they articulate that with the grammar of their own religions, in this case, Catholicism especially. And that's, I think, how I see the problem, to the extent I understood your question.
Thank you so much. Other questions?
If I could jump in with a question here, I was very curious. Well, first of all, thank you. That was such a rich lecture, and I was thinking about the way you gave this account of the origins of both reactionary denominationalism and progressive corporatism. I was thinking of Teresa Keeley's book on the foreign policy debates during the Reagan White House that were in many ways intra-Catholic, and in fact the instrumental way that Catholics played in both the formation and the growth of the moral majority. We often think of Jerry Falwell, Protestant evangelicals, but Catholics from its inception were key players there. And so I wondered, to what, and then to see these interesting alliances now in Peru among conservative Catholics and evangelicals, and I wondered, well, just if you could think a little bit or comment on the origins, those Catholics in the U.S. in the 80s. We're basically embodying a kind of reactionary denominationalism when one would think Catholics would be more predisposed to a corporatism. Factors for that? Does it have to do with the radically different location of Catholicism in the United States as opposed to Latin America? Or I wonder what thoughts you might have in that direction.
Yeah, that's a great question for which I don't know if I have a great answer, but let me give it a shot. So I think that this is not a topic I know with enough depth. I would like to caution, but to the extent I do, I think that the point you made toward the end is crucial. I think there is something essential in terms of the radically different location of Catholics and just Catholicism as a religion and culture in the US, right? I mean, not exactly, but almost the opposite, right, in Latin America. Whereas you have like massive expansion of Protestantism, with the colonizers and on, and then you have really slowly, kind of penetration of, some Catholics, Irish, Polish, Italian, whatever, And these are, as you know, not really included in the kind of American imagination for a long time. So in my experience, seeing other elements of Catholic, I guess, political, let's say, conservative political intervention in the US, that's often driven by that social location in the country and the sense of, sort of the need to foster Catholic identity that was inherited over the generations because of the sense that your identity is always at risk because you're a minority and not very well welcome. So that will be one thing. The other thing that is important to mention here, and about this, I don't know the numbers, you may know, Michael, but I would have some doubts about how much the participation of Catholics in the moral majority movement was representative of the more of general Catholic population in the country. I don't know. I mean, you may correct me there, but I would suspect that there was already there some distance between the leaders of the movement and people organizing there and where the majority was. I might be completely off here, but that will be an initial suspicion, because then you have an interesting situation, right? Which is the leadership of the church. You could talk about that currently in the Conference of Bishops, right? The official appointed leaders, let's say, are not necessarily representatives of where most Catholics are going. And some of the comments I made today are very much based not only in the case of Latin America, but also the US, which perhaps is more obvious in terms of the distance between the bishops and the laity. But so I guess to summarize, I think something about social location, I think is crucial. And then the other issue is, I will try to get, maybe for my own interest, more data on how much Catholics on the ground, if you will, were represented by some of the ones acting in the moral majority movement. Because with evangelicals, it's a bit different. I'm not saying that the leaders are represented everybody, but there's a good chunk that are represented by the leadership in moral majority and also in the model of reactionary denominationalism in Latin America. And I think that's an important difference. Anyways, that's the beginning of an answer.
Thank you so much. I want to remind our guests to use the Q&A if they would like to pose a question. In the meantime, I have another question for you, Raúl, which
go for it.
Is we actually had a reading group today at Fordham that some of us participated in, considering Laudate Deum, Francis's exhortation, follow-up to Laudato Si on the environment. And in that document, he makes a point of describing change, right? He's really interested in power in that document. He's really thinking about how we think about what power is, what we do with our power, how power actually works, and what's a responsible way to harness power in directions that are constructive and helpful for mitigating the crisis around climate. One of the things he talks about as he describes this in the midst of all this is what he calls multilateralism from below. And what this means is a kind of grassroots or bottom-up progress or pressure on hierarchical or dominant institutions and voices and centers of power. So what I'm wondering, and this spurred a conversation in our group today along these lines. So I'm wondering what you think about that, what you think about, in particular, the prospect or likelihood that the progressive corporatists in Peru and elsewhere that you're observing, that the church, the official church, what is the likelihood that the official church lines up behind the progressive corporatists? In other words, comes to be shaped by, pressured by, influenced by the power of those kinds of organizations. You're making the case that they represent a majority of Catholics' perspective. So do you have any sense that the official church will be moved to line up behind that kind of organization, and in the process bring to bear the very significant institutional authority and structures of the official church onto the issues that we're concerned about?
Yeah. um, that's a question I get every now and then, and I'm grateful for it. I don't really have a great answer, or if you will, some of the answer is also toward the end of the lecture today, right? Which is that, I mean, I don't see, to the extent I can see things right now, right, that things are going to move at the pace people expect things to move, right? And I appreciate your point. I wrote some time ago a chapter in a book honoring Gustavo Gutierrez, and the title of the chapter was something like A Cautious Revolution. And one of the things that I argue in that piece is that one of the reasons why Gutierrez was so successful at kind of introducing the main ideas of liberation theology in really the magisterium of the church, and one could say Pope Francis, depending on how close or far you want to say he is to liberation theology, is because he was immensely patient and kind of waited for 50 years, getting a lot of heat and things, to actually be able to make these things, slowly be introduced in the global thinking of the church, right? Of course, this was on the ground too, but it's important to have the Pope, the documents saying things like this, right? But one of the things I said there is like, look, I have the greatest respect for Gustavo Gutierrez, a friend and a beloved mentor, but I don't know if people have that patience, right? Or like, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the kind of speedy anxiety for change is necessarily the best way to go, right? Because there are new things that we need to maybe examine with more caution and whatever it is. And I think that's very important. But I do see like very different paths here, right? Francis, the Pope, seems to be very open to certain things, and definitely the synodal path is something I think that will have some important influence in the church. But there is still big issues pending, right? The question of women is a major issue, and Francis is not as open to that. And there's ways in which one can understand that, but there is also people who's like, I'm not gonna just keep getting crumbs from the table, right? And I think that is a big problem. But as I said, creative developments do happen. There are turns that happen, and things like change rapidly. So that could happen too. So there is always a bit of hope.
Thank you for that. A question came into me from one of our guests, and it goes like this. I assume Peruvian progressive corporatists were formed within institutional structures. Have they set up any kinds of structures or traditioning for their children so that they will continue to see these social activist spaces as sacred?
Yes, to the extent I can tell, yes. Thanks for the question. The interesting thing is, in some ways, I would even think as the children as the best representative of the progressive corporate model, in the sense that the children, in many ways, have inherited this commitment to social justice. I see this, for instance, very clearly in the people who were actively doing liberation theology work in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then their children who are more or less my age, a bit older, a bit younger, right? And you see all these people are very committed to social justice, are very interested, in the politics of the country and, fair treatment for all, etc. But they are less religious, if by that we mean affiliated to the Catholic Church, right? And this is interesting to me because this is kind of what I had in mind when I was thinking about this model. It's like, is these people? Because these people are really thinking about this commitment to social justice from the tradition they got from their parents of, faith committed to action and to transforming the world. But they do not find the church as the adequate kind of a space to be in, if not worse, which is not a legitimate actor anymore, right? And I think that's a bit of the problem. I think part of my interest in my own work, also being sort of part of that generation, is to try to think about carve some alternatives instead of just the staying all in or going, And I think people sort of do, right? I mentioned it in the lecture, this concept of diffuse Catholicism that comes from a Chilean sociologist. But the idea, I think, is people in the long history of Catholicism have always negotiated their Catholic identity with their other identities, right? And I think it's also important to keep in mind, because sometimes we get this idea that there is this kind of group of perfect Catholic that checks all the boxes, and that's really the minority, right? Most of us are Catholics or whatever we are in different ways. And I think we do see some of that. What I think is interesting, I think that's the risk or the problem I was highlighting, is that leaves the institutional strength of the Catholic Church kind of untapped, right? And I think that rethinking ways to return is perhaps important, but it also has a lot to do with how the institutional church behaves as well. Now, probably all of us know different church spaces, right? And we all know that this depends a lot on the parish, on the bishop, or things like that. There's a lot of places where a lot of great things happen today, right? The problem is that many of these things are done like kind of, hidden, like, okay, let's do these, but not talk too much or whatever. So I think that is something for which people are having less patience. But then it really comes to the question of how we produce, going back to your point on Laudate Deum, right? How do we produce change? How we use power? And it's a complex question. And I think Francis definitely has a point.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for your thoughtful replies and for your really, really terrific first-rate research, your thoughtfulness and the sophistication and nuance of your writing. All of it stands as a testament to what's possible in scholarship around religion and democracy, politics. So we want to thank you and congratulate you. Reminder just to our group that are listening that the talk will be available on our website in short order. And in the meantime, please stay tuned to the Catholic Studies Current Center social media feeds and to our newsletters so that you can keep up on all the things that we have on offer in this fall and in the coming spring semester as well. But most importantly, please join me in thanking Professor Zegarra for his wonderful talk and incredible paper. So congratulations, and thank you everybody for being here, and everybody have a good evening. Good night.
Bye. Thank you so much.